I don't care what it is. Some of you have lost a job and you've been stuck thinking that you're not worth anything and that God's not blessing you. Well, listen, you need to understand that you're living in the middle of God's blessing and start seeing that for what it is. And sometimes things are removed from our life before things are added, or even simultaneously. But whatever it is, you are worth something. It's been quite a journey, especially for me. This whole series, this whole story of Jacob, and looking at some of these points and these truths that come with his life and the life of the people that are around him. And today will be no different. Now, I will say today you'll be challenged. You will be challenged to the junk in your life. Mistakes, bad decisions, mess-ups, tragedies, people's words, people's hurts, whatever it may be, that maybe you have pushed to the side. See, I'm the type of person that believes that we will always deal with that stuff until we face it, conquer it, and go through it. That's just what I believe. Because this is what I know. Remember we talked about rejection? And how most people that get to those walls of rejection in those places, they don't look, like I said, rejection is not necessarily, an end to things. It could be a redirection. But most people don't take that redirected path to get to where God wants them to be. They stop and they turn around. And if all that stuff in your life and all those moments in your life are still back there, when you turn around, they're going to be facing you again. So my prayer today is that you deal with them. And that we bring them, we put them right here. And maybe they haven't been right here for a long time. But today I believe we can conquer some things in this story. We're going to finish in Genesis chapter 35. Not as many verses today. I know it's a busy day today, so I'm going to be rather short. I'm going to get to the point, and we're going to get to the purpose that God has. Verse 16. Then they moved on from Bethel. Remember, Jacob he went back there for the second time. And when he went back this second time, he didn't go back throwing fleeces. He went back to worship God because he got to the place where he recognized who God was and God had changed him. And so he went back just simply to worship him. So God had blessed him with his presence, and it was amazing. And so they moved on from there. And while they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. Remember, Rachel is the love of his life. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." Verse 18. As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni. But his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem, over her tomb. Jacob set a pillar, and to this day that pillar marks her tomb. Now, it had been quite a journey for Jacob up until now, and really Rachel too, but especially Jacob. Here's the deceiver, the one that constantly was trying to get things that rightfully weren't his, trying to deceive people and get those things, trying to be in control of everything, pretending to be somebody that he wasn't. And remember, we talked, God can't bless who we pretend to be. He can't, because that's not who he created us to be. Okay, so in recognizing this, Jacob once again has been there twice. He'd experienced his life change. God had kept his promises. He kept his promises in Jacob's life. And so he ended up building an altar there and worshiping God there. And he stopped making deals with God. And God just became enough. And remember, we said last week, until God becomes everything in your life, until he becomes the forefront in your life, all the it stuff, all the stuff that comes along. See, we try to make finances and material possessions to be everything, but God has to be everything. He has to be it. And until that happens, we will never be satisfied. You will never be content in your life. So Jacob just makes a sacrifice to God. And honestly, we expect God to bless Jacob. Isn't that what we expect sometimes in our own lives? I mean, seriously, think about this. We have those huge God moments with life, or how about that moment you gave your life to Christ? And I've talked to so many people that came in and they did that, whether it was here, whether it was in a house or a work. I mean, it could be anywhere. That can happen anywhere. But then there's almost like this preconceived notion that once that happens, that life's just going to be good, right? That all my problems are going to be fixed. And we get this thought, and then we think, oh, God's going to bless me because I did this. God's going to bless me because of this moment, and God's going to bless me because I've just had a wonderful worship experience. God's going to bless me because I've just poured my life out to Him, and that's great to expect that. And I'm sure that somewhat this was expected in this story, because what Jacob had went through in his life, and he went back and he visited this place, and everything was good, and the presence of God was good, and now they're on this journey. And in a sense, we look at this, if we just read the first part of the story, we think he has blessed him because he's getting another son. And what a blessing those kids are. But in the process, Rachel starts having great difficulty. And you know, sometimes God will answer our prayers, but there's sometimes a cost that we could never imagine when He does. I mean, think about that for just a second. See, Rachel asked God to give her another son, but she did not know that it would cost her her life. It's one thing to add something to your life, but you never know what you might lose in the process. Or it's wonderful to ask God things like, use me, God. God, use me. I can remember there was a time in my life and in my wife's life where we had just kind of gotten into ministry, and we were, I was part of worship. She was working with kids. We were working with youth, and it was exciting, and we saw all the good stuff. I mean, I saw all the full altars and all the wonderful experiences. I got to see all the people saved and healed and delivered. And we got to see the teenagers saved and baptized, and radical things happen. I mean, we got to see all that, and it was great. And I'm like, God, this is what I want in my life. And I really had that calling in my life, and I felt that calling in my life. So we began to pray for it every day. My wife had a little prayer box necklace that she kept the inside folded up as tight as she could get it. That prayer of, what we then called full-time ministry. And I don't like that, because I believe we're all full-time ministers. So I'll just, I like to say occupational ministry. But it's what I felt like I was called to do. So I prayed for it. And then one day God answered my prayer, and it was like, oh, this is amazing. And I remember the day I got the call, and the day I got the call, it was actually to go to a place called Kennett over in the Boot Heel. And that was a long way. I'd been there. We'd done a couple of revivals there. It was a good place, good people. And I was like, and when I first got the call, I was like, oh, wow, this is great. But in the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh, wow, Kennett, that's a long way away. And I remember calling my mother and saying, Mom, I got the call, and we're going into ministry. She says, where's it at? And I said, Kennett, and she was like, And I remember she told me later that and you correct me if I'm wrong, but that you prayed, God, if this is what you're going to do it. Just do it closer to home. And I went home that night, and I remember just being torn, like, God, I know you just gave me this, but this isn't really what I prayed for. But he listened to my mama before probably that night more than he listened to me, because the next day I got a call to go to Lebanon. That was only an hour away. But I remember being really excited, and, we got to go up there and pick out our house, and it wasn't even hardly built yet, and we got to pick colors out, and it was a big home, nice new subdivision, and big, huge church. It was growing. They're going to build another church, and, I'm getting to go play worship music for a living, and somebody's going to pay me for that. And I'm like, this is great. And I remember the first week I got called, and they said, you need to go to the hospital in Columbia and visit this man. He's got a bad heart, and he's going to die. He was a big old gruff, just, And I remember walking there, and he was kind of a cantankerous man. Some would say he was rude and mean. And I remember sitting there in that room and talking to him, and it just so happened that that's the day he was getting out. He didn't have no way home. And he said, can you take me home? And I said, well, yeah, I guess I can take you home. Let's go. So I loaded him up, and I took him home, and we had this great conversation. And I thought, you know what? This is it. This is what it's about, God. And this is amazing. And you're blessing me, and you're using me. And it wasn't but just like 3 weeks later, 3 weeks, I was standing in the foyer, and this man was wanting to whip my tail in the foyer on a Sunday morning. True story, because my youth pastor had counted wrong. Because he thought he was inflating the numbers. And I mean no disrespect to this man. He's gone on to meet Jesus, and we ended up parting ways in I'm just telling the story. I had two of the biggest deacons and two of my best friends, one on each side of me, waiting to see what was going to happen. And they were ready to throw down to protect me. And I'm like, this shouldn't even be happening. This isn't supposed to happen. This is ministry. And I remember overhearing conversations of people that were talking bad about me and talking bad about our pastor, and our youth pastor, and talking bad about my wife. And I remember all this cantankerous stuff going on. And I remember calling back to my pastor and saying, Pastor Gary, this isn't supposed to happen. And he said, well, actually, it does. And I remember the next few months, and I remember being just absolutely just overwhelmed and torn. People saying this and doing that and all of this stuff. And I'm just like, oh. And it was just, it wasn't what I necessarily thought that it would be. Did God bless me? Yes, He did. Did He answer my prayer? Yes, He did. But it cost me more than I could have ever imagined. Yes, it did. See, I can relate to this, and it's not anything special about me, but a lot of people say, I want to be a pastor. Please bless me with that. I mean, how hard could it be? Study a few notes, talk a little bit, do a funeral and a couple weddings. Maybe get to play a round of golf every once in a while. But see, what they don't see in the beginning is the burdens of others that you carry with you every single day. See, I worry about your problems. Now, I can relate to this. I'm using it as an illustration. I'm not trying to make myself up here. It's an illustration. This could be anything, but I worry about your problems. I pray for you when nobody else may pray for you. I get woken up in the middle of the night when sometimes I'd rather be sleeping. People say things, hurtful things. People do things, hurtful things. The late night calls, the difficult decisions, and making tough calls that make people mad, and sometimes it costs you your friends. I've lost some close people. Sitting with families who are broken from sickness or loss, and you don't have all the answers, and I could go on and on and on. Has God blessed me? Yes, He had. Did I pray for this blessing? I sure did. But it cost me? It sure does. It's kind of the same thing with following Christ. He tells us to take up our cross and follow Him daily. You think that's easy? Could you imagine picking up, I can go back here and get in the back and this big cross that we have back here and just have you start walking circles with that big, it's going to get heavy. It's not an easy journey. But does He bless you? Yes, He does. It's a blessing. I can promise you that no one who's ever answered the call to follow Christ has a clue what they're getting into in any capacity. And I have to believe that all those around Jacob and Rachel were celebrating the fact that Rachel was having another baby, that God had heard her prayer, but then things turned south, and Rachel actually dies as her child is being born. And another point from this passage that Furtick brought out that I want to share this one specifically with you was this. In our lives, something is always dying while something else is coming alive. In your life, something will always be dying while something else is being born. It's a life cycle. It's a life cycle. We see it in our own lives as individuals. You see it, in animals, trees, buildings, even churches have life cycles. Something dies, something is born. Kids, look at my granddaughter here, so tiny and so. It's a part of life. And you know what? Many times people have this saying when it comes to life. Say, well, how's life? It's all good. You've heard it and probably said it. But guess what? It's not. It's not all good. We say it's all good, and sometimes it is good. But the key word in that, it's all good. It's not all good. Let's be real. The whole thing about this church is to point people to a real relationship with a real God. And we do that by being real people delivering a real message. I'll never sugarcoat anything, and I'll never put icing on something that tastes bad. Life sometimes gets tough. Life sometimes gets hard. Say it's all good. Life doesn't work that way for everyone. So if you're wanting for it to be all good, all your relationships to be all good, all your finances to be all good, your marriages to be all good, and listen, I have a good marriage, but it's not always good. Amen, baby? And those of you that have been through it, My grandparents been married 70 plus years. And I can promise you, as good as an example and as good as a relationship, if I brought them up here, they would say, it's not always been good. It's just life. And life just happens, and we see that in this story today. And right now, it's not all good for Jacob. Something is being born, but something is dying. And listen, God never promises it to be all good. Jesus said, in this life, you will have trouble. That's what he says. He doesn't say, in this life, it's going to be great. Now, he does say he came to give an abundant life. But he doesn't say, I came to give you a life that's all going to be good. He says, in this life you'll have trouble. But in the next breath he says, but take heart, I've overcome all that. And in Romans he says, all things work together for good. For them that love the Lord. Now, notice he didn't say all good things. He said all things, which means all good things and all bad things. He collectively can bring them together because of who he is and work them all out for good. Now, it's hard for us to see that because we're living in the moment. God's up there wherever God is looking down and saying, I've got control of this. When we're down here on this earth freaking out or going through whatever. Sometimes I wish we had a direct phone line to God. Where, the phone would ring, you guys know, and I know this. And we'd pick up the phone and God'd say, just calm down, I got this. Wouldn't it be so easy if you could just hear that audible voice of God? Just say, it's okay, calm down. That's where faith comes in. But God does this. He just makes all things work. See, some of you today, you have joy, but you also have frustration. Some of you today have happiness, but you also have sadness. Something is always being born, but something is always dying. And God understands this because he understands life. All right, really quickly, let's look at these verses again. Just verse 17. As she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said, don't despair, for you're having another son. Can I just say, remember a few weeks ago, I've said this a couple times. Be careful in your struggles and situations who you go to, because we tend to gravitate towards people who will tell us what we want to hear and not necessarily what we need to hear. Okay, that's been a really big spoken truth that we have shared. Well, listen, sometimes we need people in our lives to help us see that even though we're experiencing pain, God is also fulfilling his promise. And that's what this lady said to Rachel, said, don't despair, because what you prayed for is happening. And sometimes we need those people. You need to surround yourself with people that will tell you and speak truth, but that will lift you up in those times that you need them the most. That'll be real with you and remind you. In verse 18, as she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni. So Rachel, with her last breath, says, name the child Benoni. Now, Ben means son of. That first part of that word means son of. Now, Oni has two different meanings here. And they're really ironic, both of them. The first one is that Benoni means son of sorrow. Son of sorrow. And it's very obvious with this picture that we painted with this story why that was. She understood that she wasn't going to get to experience his life. She understood that she wasn't going to experience him growing up and all of this. And in her sorrow, in that moment, she knew she was dying. She named him the son of my sorrow. But Oni can also mean strength. It can also mean strength. And it's ironic because as you look at these two definitions, you think, oh boy, this is really a clash in this story. It can be son of my sorrow or son of my strength. And it looks like these are crazy opposite views and definitions of this word, but what if they aren't all that separate? What if they actually work together? What if great strength is born out of great sorrow? Perhaps real strength is only ever born out of great sorrow. I would challenge you this. The people in your life that you know that are the strongest are probably the strongest because they've been through some of the deepest sorrow. They've had those moments that have torn them in awful ways. But they're strong today, maybe, because of experiencing that sorrow. And look at Jesus. Great example of both. He is broken for his people. He is broken from being beaten. He's broken from being hung on a cross, yet finds the strength to very simply say, Father, forgive them. Isaiah described Jesus as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So he understands your sorrow. I've always said that I believe this. Jesus has been everywhere that I will ever go. That's what I believe. And so he is a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. See, it was the crucifixion that brought the strength of the resurrection. So if you see someone with great strength, you can almost bet that that person had experienced great sorrow. But today, what I'm going to get to over the next 5 to 10 minutes, this is really what I want to share out of this story today. You can rename your sorrow today. Whatever you're going through, whatever you have with you, whatever you push to your past, whatever tends to just swell back up and you haven't dealt with yet, you can rename that today. Your sorrow today can become your strength for tomorrow. And the tears that you cry today might actually water the seeds that are planted for tomorrow. Watch this. So she had just named him Benoni, son of my sorrow. But in verse 18 it says, but his father, Jacob, named him Benjamin. You know Jacob was hurting. That was the love of his life. He worked 14 years for this lady. He fell in love with her at first sight. Remember at the beginning of the story when he saw her coming, how awestruck he was? Hey, brother, I just saw you. It's so good to see you. You remember how awestruck, how beautiful, how mesmerized? He loved her. And the love of his life just died. And so you know that he was experiencing great sorrow. But he refused to name the child that was born out of sorrow according to the sorrow that gave the child birth. Or in other words, he refused to name this child's destiny based on this child's history. So they come and they tell Jacob that Rachel's gone, and Rachel had given this child the name Benoni, but Jacob clearly decides against that name. Now in culture back then, the father had the name-giving rights. The father had the naming rights. The father was the one that was responsible for naming the child back then culturally. The mother could suggest it, but it was the father that named the child. And how significant in this story. Might not be fair, but that's how it worked. So Rachel had basically given a suggestion, but it was Jacob who had the final say in that name. And can I just say today that there may be people in your life today that have or are trying to name you, but only God, your heavenly Father, has the right to approve that name? Only Him. Nobody else has the right to give you a name that maybe, and you know what, maybe your past and maybe your circumstances and maybe all that stuff, maybe they look at it and think, well, you know, you're just a loser or you're worthless or you're nothing, you mean nothing, you can't accomplish anything. Or maybe they look and say, they've given you the name addict or dirt or whatever it might be. And that name comes from your circumstances, it comes from people, whatever it comes from, they have no right to name you. But the unfortunate thing is that's the name we grab a hold of. See, we don't grab a hold of the name forgiven. We don't grab a hold of the name clean. We don't grab a hold of the name free. But those are the names that God gives you. The only one that has a right to give you that name is Him. It's Him. Loser, quitter, good for nothing, hopeless, trash. Only God. And some of you today, you need to peel the name label off and you need to give it a new name. You need a new name today. So Jacob decides his child will not be named from a moment in life, so he names him Benjamin. And see, Benjamin has a lot of experience with new names. Remember, he was given a new name. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. We know that. We also know that he changed a few names. He renamed Luz to Bethel, which means house of God or gate of heaven. One time he was running from Esau, and he renamed a place where he saw a host of angels surrounding him, and he named that place Mahanaim, which means encampment of God. There was a place where Jacob ended up wrestling with God. Remember, we talked about that early in this series. And he ended up renaming that place Peniel, that means face of God. So he's renamed all these places. He's even been renamed himself. And in this moment of his son being born, maybe Jacob was like, you know what? I've renamed places. God's given me a new name. I think I'm going to do the same thing. So he calls him Benjamin. Remember, Ben means son. Jamin, Benjamin. And remember, Jacob is looking at a tragedy. He's looking at a loss. He's looking at a pain. He's looking at a hurt, despair. And he says, I think I'll call him Benjamin. Remember when Jacob stole Esau's blessing? Remember that part of the story? See, the father gave the blessing. This is when a father back then would give a blessing, he gave it with his right hand. And when he would pray over that oldest child, he would lay that right hand on their forehead. And that's how the blessing would be passed from the daddy to the son. And so Rachel had named that child son of my sorrow. But Benjamin means son of my right hand. It means son of my blessing. See, in that moment where he had every right to experience sorrow and maybe even allow that sorrow to direct his life, whatever you want to say, in that moment he said, no, that's not going to be the son of my sorrow. That's going to be the son of my blessing. He changed the name. Every right to be called son of sorrow, but he said, no, it's the son of my blessing. He said, I've got a right hand. Because see, before, remember, he would manipulate, he deceived out of that blessing, but then he had just come from the place where God had told him, no, I am your blessing, and he recognized that he had that blessing. He could be a blessing, and by the way, here's a side note. Sometimes we sit around waiting to be blessed all the time when honestly, God expects us to get up and be the blessing. That's free. So Jacob named his son, son of my right hand. So many people spend their life waiting for their blessing. Be one. It's time to use your right hand. We keep waiting on our circumstances to change or to end up being perfect so that we can be blessed. But maybe it's time to recognize the blessings and the battles or the strength and the sorrow and use your right hand and call it what you want. Name it what you want. You don't have to be stuck with that name. You don't have to be stuck with whatever title somebody's given you because of your stupid decisions or your sin or your mistakes or whatever it might be. Some of you need to rip that label off and allow God to rename you for who you are and who He's created. And that's just being, and I don't know what your situation is. I don't know what the struggle is. I don't know what the sorrow is. I don't know what that is, but somebody has given you a name that has stuck with you, and it has molded you and shaped you into somebody that you don't want to be, and it is time to rip that off and allow God to put a new one on and say, this is just who I am. It hit me this morning. And nothing in my notes, but in the very first service it hit me, and man, did it hit me hard. 20 years. This year, I've been clean. 20 years. And for so long, people gave me a name. See, when I was growing up, I was given a name by a lot of people. I mean, I was the good church kid that went to my grandfather was the Billy Graham of the Ozarks, and my parents were just awesome people, and I went to church, and I did all this, and I was a superstar jock athlete, and I was good, and I could do this, and I could do that, and then all of a sudden, I threw that away. And so all of those good names, just like that, people said, worthless, loser, addict. And those names stuck with me, and they stuck with me. But it wasn't until a point in time in my life when I realized, and I did realize it, you've heard my story, most every single one of you, that it wasn't people who defined me, it was God. and you rip that name off and you give the name back to you that God had given to you. Some of you need to get rid of your labels. Now, 20 years later, I look back and I think of the things that I did, and I think of the things that I said, especially to people like my parents and my family. I think of the people that, honestly, I'm responsible for where they are. I take responsibility. I know they're old and they're adults. They have their own, they can make their own choices. If they want to get out, they can get out. But I still look at those individuals that still struggle with that today. And I take some of that responsibility. But listen, even in that, it doesn't define me. It doesn't name me. My circumstances it's not me. Some of you today, you've made those choices and you've just chosen to sweep them behind you. Put them right here and deal with it. Some of you have been hurt by something that somebody has said. Some of you have been hurt by a relationship. It could be, I don't care what it is. Some of you have lost a job and you've been stuck thinking that you're not worth anything and that God's not blessing you. Well, listen, you need to understand that you're living in the middle of God's blessing and start seeing that for what it is. And sometimes things are removed from our life before things are added, or even simultaneously. But whatever it is, you are worth something. You matter. Rip off the stinking label that somebody else has given you and claim who God has created you to be. Live in it. Man, some of the stuff you've been calling Benoni your whole life, but God says it's time to change the name. See, at the very beginning of time, God gave Adam a job. Remember, God created Adam and he created all this stuff and it didn't have names, so he brought all of this stuff in front of Adam and he said, name it. Now, Adam didn't get to choose what was brought before him or was brought into his life. He only got to choose what he named it. And sometimes you won't have a choice about what happens in your life. Now, sometimes things happen because of our decisions. I know that very firsthand. But sometimes life just happens. Sometimes the cycle of life just happens. Sometimes we don't get to choose. But you do get to choose what you call it. You get to choose what you name your life. You get to name it. You can name it sorrow or you can name it strength. You can name it what you want. Some people say, I'll just call it like it is, and it's just disgusting or discouraging or frustrating or lonely. And honestly, and I use this terminology in the first service, I'm using it again because it's just real. Sometimes life just sucks. It's hard. And you can simply call it like it is. And see, Rachel wasn't necessarily wrong. In fact, I don't think she was wrong at all. Who would not be sorrowful over such a tragic loss and facing something so... See, those sorrowful moments, they're real. Some of us experience them at some level, some at other levels. And in my life, I've experienced some tough stuff. I've never experienced anything like my parents. And I pray to God that I never do. But our storm is our storm, right? Your storm is your storm. Maybe you've never lost a child like they have, but maybe you've been through, a broken relationship, a broken marriage. Maybe you've been through a horrible financial struggle. Maybe, it could be something health-wise. It could be something, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is just, and you know what? We could end up naming that the son of my sorrow, and you could be stuck with the name Benoni, but you know what? God's saying, no, wait a minute. He says, no, you're the son, you're the daughter of my blessing. It's time to stop settling and allowing ourselves to be stuck there. Time to stop allowing yourself to be consumed by discouragement or failure or weaknesses or mess up. It's time to give all that stuff a new name. And I'll close with this. One more thing in this story, and this is so cool. One more thing about Jacob. See, back in verse 19 and 20. He says, so Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem, and over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar. And to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. See, he mourned her. He experienced the sorrow. He lived in it. The love of his life. But then the next three words of verse 21. Israel. Boy, this got me again. He didn't call him Jacob. After all this sorrow, he said, Israel, the name that God had given him. He moved on. He moved on. See, Jacob faced that. He faced that loss. He faced that struggle. He faced that situation. He felt it. He mourned it. And then he moved on. He got up and he continued to live what life he had left. Your past holds a lot of sorrow. Maybe a lot of junk, maybe a lot of mess ups, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. But you can move on. And yes, those things will always be memories. And they'll always be a part of your past. But those names, they don't have to move with you. See, God said Israel moved on. And today, whatever new name you need, that name can move on. It's time to let go of the junk. It's time to let go of what that person said to you and move on. It's time to let go of the abuse, the belittlement. It's time to let go. And that doesn't mean you're letting go of memories. It doesn't mean that you're letting go of the things that you've learned. It doesn't mean that you're letting go of those reminders of what to do and what not. It doesn't mean any of that. It's time to let go of family hurt. It's time to stop allowing your past circumstances to define your today and affect your